Earlier this year, actually it was in April, reporters with the Associated Press were given a state-led tour to China's far west Xinjiang region, and they were granted access to the Urumqi number 3 detention center. Now, this is China's largest detention center and possibly the largest in the world. Now, today, the AP actually published a report on what they saw, noting that it was the first Western media organization ever allowed in. Joining me now to talk about what was reported on and perhaps what wasn't, and why the Chinese government allowed the Western journalist in, is China expert Gordon Chang. He is the author of The Coming Collapse of China and the Great U.S.-China Tech War. You can follow him on Twitter at Gordon G. Chang. But for now, he's with us. Gordon, welcome back to the program.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Tony.
All right, I was interested by this because, first off, I was wondering why, after all of the attention and the denials about these detention centers, would the Chinese government now allow Western journalists in?
I think there's so much pressure on Beijing, on the Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and others, because this is not only genocide, but crimes against humanity, and Beijing wants to push back against that. Also, remember, they're hosting the February 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing. They don't want a boycott. And so I think this is part of a concerted public relations campaign to protect their Olympic sponsorship.
That's my take on it as well. This is somewhat damage control. They're trying to get back in controlling the message. But I mean, this is a massive detention center, the largest in the country, and as I mentioned, possibly the world. It covers over 220 acres. The AP suggests that this could house up to 10,000 people in this one facility, and it's just one of many. Did we learn anything from this report that we did not already know?
We knew the broad outlines of what the Chinese are doing in these facilities. This one was partially empty. So there really wasn't very much that the AP saw in terms of Uyghurs themselves. As they point out in their report, they were not allowed to speak to the detainees. The thing, though, when we think about how big this facility is, and the AP says it's about twice the area of the Vatican, it's really that this is just one of many across Xinjiang. And that means China right now, as we learned from BuzzFeed about a week ago, can detain at any one time 1.1 million people. And that's much gives us a sense that the number of Uyghurs and Kazakhs and others who've been detained is much larger than the estimates that have been produced up to now.
A couple of things I found interesting in this is they were denying that these were re-education or training centers, that these were detention centers and pre-trial holding facilities. But the report actually says they just changed the names on the outside of the facilities. These were, in fact, the retraining centers that were previously reported on by the BBC and others.
Yeah, they literally just changed the names over the door, as the AP reported. But in a general sense, yes, really they had what they told the world were re-education centers. Now they've got detention centers because they say that people there have committed crimes. But you're right, it was really just a name change. The substance is that Beijing is continuing relentlessly to go after Muslim faith. And they're doing the same thing with Christians and Buddhists across the country. We've just had some detentions of Christians in the last 48 hours. So we know that they've stepped up this campaign against all of faith.
Gordon Chang, I also found interesting in here that they made reference to the BBC, the Chinese officials, that is, saying, here I quote, "See, the BBC report said that this was a re-education camp. It's not, it's a detention center." That was one of the officials with the Chinese foreign ministry. The BBC reported back in February about the systematic rape and torture of Uyghurs in these facilities. That really got to the Chinese, and that's what I think this is damage control, trying to go back and try to rewrite that narrative when in fact it's out there pretty broadly as to what's been happening to the Uyghurs there in Xinjiang.
Yes, Beijing has promoted this campaign against the BBC since that report, and it's been an across-the-board attack on that news organization. And so we can expect not only in this AP report, but going forward, there's going to be more attempts to take down the credibility of the BBC. I mean, they do that with all news organizations, but right now they've got the British one pretty much in their crosshairs.
You know, I was quite frankly surprised and encouraged by the BBC's reporting on what was happening, truthful reporting. And my concern is this an effort by China to co-opt some of the Western media?
They always do that. So, Tony, that is certainly, you put your finger on it. The more important dynamic going on, though, is that China's just run out of arguments. And so we are going to see more of these public relations campaigns, and they're going to become less and less credible. So right now, I think most people around the world who have thought about this realize the enormity of China's crimes, because China is what it's doing right now is comparable to what the Third Reich did prior to the mass exterminations of 1931. And in many respects, what China's doing is worse than that. The only thing that China hasn't done is mass extermination. But we know Uyghurs and others are dying in those facilities, whatever the name is, because China's been building crematoria right next to them. And that indicates that people are dying in not inconsiderable numbers.
Well, we certainly know that if we take our eyes off of this and we go silent on this, they could do almost anything. We already know about the reports of the organ harvesting that's taking place among the Falun Gong and others. By the way, one reporter, one organization they're not going to let in to report on this would be Washington Watch, because I'm sanctioned, so I can't go into China. But I'm hoping that the Western journalists will be accurate in their reporting. I did find this very interesting. It was I don't think it was slanted either way. I just think it was factual. I just think that they have to recognize they're not going to be given access to all the facts. As you said, they did not get a chance to talk to any of the detainees, whatever they are, the retrainees or whatever they want to call them. They did not have an opportunity to talk with them and see how they were in fact being treated.
No, and they certainly wouldn't be given that opportunity because they would have heard things which undercut China's narratives. We have heard from people who have been in those facilities who've been released. We've heard from people who have relatives in those facilities, and these stories are just horrible. I mean, horrific. And so we're not going to hear, any news organization talking to people inside those facilities unless the people have been vetted and speak under conditions where they've been coerced. And that would be wrong, I think, for any news organization to participate in a public relations campaign like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Gordon Chang, I want to move a little closer to home here. I want to move to Cuba. And someone say, well, what's the connection between Cuba and China? I thought Gordon was an Asian expert on China. Well, there's a big connection because China is the largest benefactor to the Cuban regime. I mean, that's where they get a lot of their support, but also technology. Let's talk a little bit about what's been happening there in Cuba and how, like, the shutting off of the internet was made possible by Chinese technology.
Yes, from the very first day of the protests, there have been internet outages, and these were intended to prevent people from learning about this. Now, there have been about protests in 40 or more cities and towns. So at this point, Cuba is sort of fighting a losing struggle. The point here, though, is Chinese technology enabled this. You got technology from Huawei and from its sister company, ZTE. Cuba has been importing the social credit system that Beijing is perfecting. And so really, this is a made in China program, which the Cuban government has been using against its own people.
And of course, they've been using, the Chinese have been using their propaganda machine as they say this is all about America. It's because the U.S. embargo that Cuba is having this difficulty.
Yes, from the very beginning of these protests, Beijing has been saying that the sole cause and the origin of the problems in Cuba is the U.S. embargo. And this has been a malicious campaign that continues to this day. Also, China has been very much as a proponent of these votes in the UN General Assembly condemning the UN embargo. The General Assembly this year, the 29th straight time, they voted against the U.S. Well, China is very much behind all of that push, as well as the propaganda that you referred to.
When you look at all of this, you have to look at, I think we need to look at U.S. policy towards China, because they are exporting this technology to tyrannical regimes. And I guess taking, we say, well, we don't want to get too involved in that. Well, part of it, our funding of the World Bank and the money that we put in, China is taking out. They're being treated as a third world country, a developing country, I should say. And so we're actually in many ways indirectly funding the work that they're doing to counter democracy in other parts of the world.
Yeah, you put your finger on a critical point, and maybe even the critical point, because it's not only World Bank funding for this. We've got, for instance, companies that are trading with China, giving them the technology, facial recognition technology for these social control systems. A lot of the hardware and the software comes from big U.S. tech companies. And then in a broader sense, we have our trade, our investment with China that has been actually giving China the resources to do all these things that we've talked about, and technical cooperation agreements between our universities and theirs. Big giveaway of the best technology in the world, often for nothing. So, you go across the board, China is able to threaten the United States and others because of its access to our markets and, as you say, the World Bank.
None of it adds up, other than, I think there's a consumer portion here. Consumers in America like cheaper products. And, we want good products. We want them at a good price. We want a deal. And I think that is probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my take on this is that that's China's greatest leverage over America is the consumers. And if we would begin to exercise discipline here and realize what's at stake here with these cheap products, I will tell you, our family does not buy anything from China. We look, in fact, you see this mug here in front of me. We had to search around to find mugs not made in China. Now, we had to pay more for it, but we're not going to do anything that's going to facilitate a regime that is oppressing people the way the Chinese Communist Party is.
Yeah, and there's a lot of low-cost jurisdictions where the U.S. government, through some preferential policies, can encourage companies to locate so that those countries can provide goods at a price cheaper than China. So, for instance, Central America, the Northern Triangle, that is the source of 40% of the migrants pressing our southern border. Those countries were destabilized by China's accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001, when factories not only left America, but they left Central America as well. Now, if we can encourage those factories to come back, we certainly make our neighborhoods safer and we preserve our border. There's so many things we can do. And one other thing, Tony, if we encourage companies to manufacture in our continent, that's reducing carbon emissions, because 15 of those large container ships, they produce as much carbon as all the world's cars. So we can have so many wins. We can go after China, we can clean the environment, we can preserve peace and stability in our own border. All of this by getting companies, manufacturing here. Yes,
and it provides greater stability for the supply chain, especially
Absolutely.
As we found in this last year when we're talking about medical supplies. We don't want to be dependent upon the creator of the COVID virus to help us overcome the COVID virus.
No, absolutely. Because China tried to use and actually did use its position in supply chains for personal protective equipment. And they threatened to throw us into what they said was a mighty sea of coronavirus. China tries to use its position in supply chains, not only with protective equipment, but across the board, rare earths, for instance. So
Right.
We've got to make sure we're more resilient.
Gordon Chang, always great to talk with you. You're a great guest, knowledgeable. Love to talk with you. Thanks so much for being on today.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Tony. I really appreciate the opportunity.